They told the public it was a hospital, a place of healing. But if you stood outside those walls in the dead of night, you wouldn't hear prayers or the calm voices of doctors. You'd hear something else. The sound of chains dragged across stone floors, the faint moan of someone trying not to scream. And every so often, the kind of cry that doesn't sound human anymore. A cry ripped from the depths of someone who has realized there is no escape. The asylum promised care, but what they were really perfecting inside was something older, darker. Experiments that blurred the line between medicine and torture. The institution's founding records are still redacted, sealed by state orders that no historian has ever been allowed to touch. What little is known comes from letters smuggled out, from death certificates that never listed a cause, and from the ruins of the building itself, charred black after a fire that officials swore was accidental. But you and I know better. Fires don't erase records by chance. Fires are chosen. Fires are final. Imagine a stone structure rising out of the forest, its windows placed deliberately high so no one could look in. The basement extended deeper than the foundations required, with drains carved into the floor, as if the architects knew in advance that large volumes of liquid, blood perhaps, would need to be disposed of. They told the townspeople it was built this way for sanitation. Yet every brick, every reinforced door, every ventilation shaft whispers something else. Containment. This wasn't just a hospital. It was a theater of control. Patients didn't arrive of their own free will. Families sent them, neighbors reported them, churches delivered them. Women who spoke too boldly, men who refused authority, children who asked too many questions. Once the asylum doors closed, the world was told they were being treated. But inside, they were being studied, like rats in a maze, dissected in body and in mind. You were never meant to hear this. What happened in those rooms wasn't science. It wasn't madness. It was something far worse, an experiment in how far human beings can be broken, and still called healed. The first documented whispers of the asylum's forbidden work began with disappearances that were never officially linked to the institution, yet everyone in the town understood the pattern. Families would arrive with a relative, sometimes a son given to seizures, sometimes a daughter who refused marriage, sometimes an elder who no longer obeyed, and after a few weeks there would be silence. No word, no letters, no visits allowed. The asylum claimed it was for the privacy and dignity of the patients, but behind closed doors, experiments were escalating beyond comprehension. Survivors later described corridors lined with iron doors where the sound of weeping was constant, where meals were delivered through sliding slots like prison cells, and where treatments always happened at night. They spoke of restraints bolted to gurneys, of crude trephination drills biting into skulls without anesthesia, of chemicals injected not to heal but to alter thought itself. They were trying to unmake and remake the human mind, peeling it back layer by layer, as if thought and obedience could be engineered the same way you would rewire a clock. In the hidden ledgers that escaped the fire, terms appeared over and over: personality correction, obedience induction, reclamation therapy. But the truth behind those clinical words was pure horror. Victims were left in darkness for days, only to be pulled into rooms flooded with blinding light. They were denied food until they begged for it like animals, then fed substances that kept them docile, compliant, malleable, and when the drugs wore off, the surgical experiments began. Pieces of the brain excised in the name of purging delusions, nervous systems wired with crude electrical devices to study how much pain could be inflicted before consciousness collapsed. These were not healers. These were engineers of suffering, men and woe. Men who believed the human soul itself could be modified, stripped, and rebuilt into something obedient, something useful. And the worst part? They weren't doing this in isolation. Letters preserved in private collections suggest government officials visited, clergy blessed the work as necessary discipline, and wealthy patrons bankrolled the continuation of experiments long after rumors began spreading. Everyone knew. Everyone turned away. The asylum didn't stand apart from society. It was the mirror of its darkest desires. There is one detail that almost no one talks about, but it is the key to understanding why the asylum existed at all. None of the experiments were random. Every incision, every deprivation, every scream was catalogued with meticulous precision, as if pain itself were a language waiting to be translated. In the hidden journals that survived, diagrams of brains were annotated not with medical terms, but with words like submission, belief, erasure, and rebirth. They weren't trying to cure madness. They were trying to manufacture obedience. Picture a patient strapped beneath oil lamps, their skull opened while the surgeon calmly marks the tissue with ink, recording which cuts silence fear, which shocks erase memory, which chemical doses strip away defiance. This was not medicine but architecture, a blueprint for controlling the human will. And when you realize that, you begin to see why the institution was untouchable. Politicians spoke of it as a blessing, a beacon of progress. Judges referred offenders there instead of prison, knowing full well they would never return. Priests justified it as purification of sin, cloaking scalpels and shackles in the language of salvation. The asylum had become more than a building. It was a laboratory for power, a place where authority itself learned how to bend flesh, bone, and thought into submission. Yet there was a cost, a flaw in their designs they could never fully control. Survivors, though broken, carried fragments of what they had seen. Some wandered into town speaking in fragmented whispers, describing faces in white coats that appeared like priests but behaved like butchers. Others returned home, changed in ways that terrified their families. They would sit for hours staring at walls, unable to remember their own names, yet when given a command, they obeyed instantly, as if their will had been hollowed out and replay. Said. These living ghosts became the asylum's greatest secret, proof that their methods worked, but also evidence that the soul cannot be cut without consequence. And so the fire came. The cleansing flame that devoured paper, flesh, and stone, leaving only rumor behind. But fire cannot burn memory. It cannot erase the fact that what happened there was never about curing the insane. It was about testing how far humanity could be stripped of its essence, until what remained was no longer human at all, but a machine disguised as one. What the fire didn't consume, whispers carried. Travelers spoke of smoke rising from the forest that smelled not just of wood, but of scorched flesh and chemicals, an odor that lingered for weeks after the ashes cooled. Locals who ventured near the ruins swore the air itself felt heavy, as if the cries of the broken still clung to the stone. But deeper than superstition, there were fragments. Ledgers half-burnt, surgical instruments warped by heat, restraints fused into iron frames, objects that testified to something far darker than insanity. One recovered page described Patient 47, a boy of 12 deemed incorrigible by his parish, who was kept in sensory isolation for 30 days and subjected to electrical currents that caused him to lose speech entirely. Another entry spoke of reformatives, where the patient was deprived of sleep and fed a mixture of opiates and stimulants until their perception of time collapsed, leaving them so disoriented they would accept any command just to anchor themselves back to reality. These were not isolated atrocities, they were protocols, and protocols imply intent. The asylum was not run by madmen, it was run by people who understood that fear, starvation, and pain are not only tools of control, but formulas that can be repeated, scaled, and applied. That's why officials shielded it, why clergy blessed it, why funding flowed. The institution wasn't an aberration. It was the training ground for something much larger. To understand this is to understand why entire governments later adopted eerily similar methods under different names. Interrogation techniques, behavioral corrections, re-education. The asylum was the seed, the prototype, the first attempt to rewrite the mind, not as a healer, but as a programmer. And once you see that pattern, you can't unsee it. The techniques tested in those stone basements never died. They sprung, like a contagion, carried in secret journals and whispered networks of men who knew exactly what knowledge they were protecting. That is the true horror of the asylum's forbidden medical experiments, that they were never destroyed, only renamed, refined, and buried under official language. Which means the asylum isn't just history, it is alive inside the systems that still decide who is normal, who is broken, and who must be made to obey. The legacy of the asylum did not end with its collapse into smoke and rubble. It simply changed costume, slipping into the polished language of medicine, education, and governance. By the turn of the century, the very same techniques once hidden behind crumbling stone walls began to reappear under the guise of progress. Isolation was no longer called punishment, but therapeutic seclusion. Sleep deprivation became experimental vigilance training. The deliberate breaking of children's minds was reframed as moral instruction in state-run orphanages and boarding schools. Hospitals across the country quietly adopted practices of restraint and electrotherapy, justified as humane alternatives to shackles, even though the current still left scars both physical and invisible. One particularly chilling discovery is that physicians who once walked the halls of the forgotten ward later sat on committees advising governments on how to deal with undesirables during wartime. Their reports used the same vocabulary: control, obedience, reformation, but now they had entire nations as their laboratories. The asylum's blueprint became a silent instruction manual, replicated in prison systems, in military barracks, even in classrooms where rigid discipline was sold as character building. To the public, it was progress. To those who knew the truth, it was replication. And the most unsettling part is that this transfer was not accidental, it was deliberate preservation. The asylum was not erased because it was a failure. It was erased because it succeeded too well. Destroying the building only ensured no one would stumble upon its full records, while the knowledge itself was carried forward into systems that could operate with more legitimacy. The madness of the ward was never an isolated atrocity, it was a pilot program for mass control. Which means the ghosts of those patients did not just die in their cells, they were transformed into policies, institutions, and codes of conduct that govern lives to this day. If you've ever wondered why obedience is demanded before understanding, why fear is used before compassion, why silence is enforced before questions are answered, it is because the lessons of the asylum have survived, mutating into the very bones of society. What burned in the forest 100 years ago still burns quietly in the structures we call order, discipline, and progress. And once you see it, you realize you've been living inside the asylum's shadow all along. For decades, silence reigned over the ruins, but silence has a way of fracturing when the living cannot bear the weight of the dead. Survivors, those few who walked out of the asylum's gates before the fire, carried pieces of its darkness in their broken bodies and fractured minds, and though most were dismissed as lunatics, their words etched disturbing consistencies across time. In 1909, a woman known only as Eleanor was interviewed in a sanitarium where she had been relocated. Her story, scattered by trauma, spoke of endless nights where children were awakened by whistles and dragged from their cots to be lined against stone walls, where cold water was poured over them until their lips turned blue, all under the pretense of resistance training. A farmer in the next county who once worked as a groundskeeper confessed on his deathbed that he had been ordered to dig shallow trenches behind the asylum for waste, he was told, though the stench that rose from the earth convinced him it was no ordinary refuse. Even more chilling were the accounts collected by a young journalist in 1923 who tracked down families of those committed and discovered a pattern of letters sent by patients, letters that never reached their intended homes. Instead, these messages, filled with desperate pleas to be rescued, were intercepted and stored by the institution. When the journalist uncovered one bundle, he found pages smeared with blood, others scrawled with trembling words. "They are trying to take my dreams. They are trying to change what I see when I close my eyes." The consistency of these testimonies, separated by miles and years, points to a system, not madness. And though officials dismiss them as delusions, there is a peculiar detail that threads them all together. Each survivor recalled hearing the same sound at night, a low mechanical hum echoing through the halls, followed by screams muffled behind thick doors. What machine could have produced such resonance in the late 1800s, when even electricity was scarce in rural counties? No record of such equipment exists, yet the survivors swore it was real. Their words, buried under the weight of skepticism and ridicule, stand today as perhaps the only true witnesses to what the asylum perfected in secret. And in their testimonies lies a haunting truth, that the fire may have destroyed the walls, but it could never erase the memories of those who endured them. When fragments of the asylum's blueprints surfaced in a private estate sale during the 1950s, they shocked even hardened archivists. These weren't simple floor plans of an institution for care. They were maps of control, designed with precision that betrayed intent. The wards were laid out in a radial structure, spokes of corridors extending from a central chamber like veins from a heart. But this heart was not a chapel or common hall. It was a sealed stone room marked simply as observation. The blueprints revealed chambers labeled seclusion, correction, and most disturbingly, reconstruction, each connected by hidden passages allowing staff to move unseen between wings. One sublevel drawing showed a series of cramped vaults beneath the foundation, with no indication of windows or exits, where ventilation shafts were carved directly into chimneys, as if designed to funnel screams upward and disguise them as the sounds of wind through stone. More chilling still were the annotations, handwritten notes in faded ink that hinted at experiments in sensory manipulation, light cycles, dream induction, sound deprivation. These weren't medical terms of the day, but coded instructions for altering human perception itself. Architectural historians later remarked that the asylum bore uncanny resemblance to early prison panopticons, structures engineered to make inmates feel watched at all times, even when no one was present. The asylum's design ensured not just confinement of bodies, but colonization of minds. Every hall forced patients into sightlines, every window positioned to distort light, every door narrowed to restrict movement and remind them of their powerlessness. This was not a place built to heal. It was a machine built to erase individuality, to grind people into silence until their very sense of self dissolved. The fire consumed most of the structure, but the surviving blueprints whisper that what happened inside was not chaos or accident. It was planned, mapped, engineered, an architecture of madness serving as a prototype for institutions that followed. Once you see its design, you realize the building itself was complicit, not a vessel but a weapon, a tool designed to ensure obedience and break resistance long before the first experiment even began. The asylum's walls may have fallen, but the geometry of control it pioneered lives on in the layouts of prisons, schools, and hospitals that still quietly echo its sinister blueprint. The moment whispers of those blueprints and hidden records began to surface, officials moved with startling precision to bury them, as if a century-old fire still cast a threat on their reputations and power. Archivists who handled the documents were pressured into silence, some reporting that men in dark suits appeared within days of their findings, confiscating boxes under the authority of state security. The estate sale that first revealed the asylum's design was abruptly shut down, the remaining papers purchased in bulk by an anonymous buyer, never to be seen again. Newspapers of the era that attempted to publish survivor testimonies or speculate about hidden chambers received sudden cease and desist orders, citing unverified slander against public institutions. Even the journalist who collected the intercepted patient letters in 1923 died under peculiar circumstances, an apparent fall from a train car, though his notes vanished before investigators arrived. It wasn't simply about hiding the cruelty, it was about concealing a lineage, ensuring no one could trace the asylum's methods to the very agencies that had adopted them. For buried inside those crumbling blueprints and smudged testimonies lay undeniable evidence that the asylum had not been an isolated experiment, but a state-sanctioned laboratory of control. Authorities feared not ghosts, but recognition, that people would see the roots of their own schools, hospitals, and prisons in the same geometry of power, the same rituals of silence and obedience. Erasure became policy. The ruins fenced off, the grounds purchased by private hands with deep political ties, the very name of the asylum scrubbed from county records. Official histories reduced it to a footnote, a facility lost to fire, patients transferred, as if lives had not been shattered, as if the screams had not echoed across stone vaults. But erasure is never perfect. Every attempt to silence the story only sharpened its edge, turning rumor into obsession, secrecy into suspicion. And here lies the deeper truth. If so much effort has been spent ensuring that the asylum remains forgotten, then what it concealed must be more dangerous than any ghost story. They weren't afraid of haunting, they were afraid of exposure, of a public that might recognize the machinery of control was never dismantled, only disguised. The forgotten ward was never forgotten. It was buried alive. While officials worked tirelessly to erase the asylum from memory, the townsfolk who lived in its shadow refused to forget. Their recollections, passed down in hushed conversations at kitchen tables and in stories whispered to children before bed, formed an underground archive that no government could suppress. Farmers who lived on the outskirts remembered nights when the asylum glowed faintly against the horizon, not with the light of lanterns, but with something more unnatural, an eerie flicker that pulsed like a heartbeat against the trees. Hunters swore they heard cries drifting through the woods long after the fire, voices too distinct to be wind, echoing phrases like, "Don't let them take me," or "The light is still on." Children dared one another to approach the ruins, only to return pale and trembling, claiming they saw shadows moving in places where no walls remained. One elderly midwife recounted how she was often summoned in the dead of night, escorted by orderlies who said nothing, to deliver infants inside the asylum. She never saw the mothers again, nor the babies after the first wail, only the sound of locks clicking shut and the muffled sobs that followed. Local shopkeepers spoke of asylum staff buying strange quantities of salt, lantern oil, and restraints, always in cash, always with instructions not to record the transactions. Even more unsettling were the families who sent loved ones to the ward and later received official letters declaring their relative had been successfully discharged. Yet no one ever came home, their names vanishing from census records as if they had never existed. These fragments, though often dismissed as folklore, built a tapestry of truth stronger than official silence. The people closest to the asylum knew instinctively that what burned was not just a building, but the evidence of something vast, something orchestrated. Their rail histories carried the weight of trauma disguised as ghost stories, ensuring that, despite the state's attempt to erase the past, the memory of what truly happened at the forgotten ward would never fully die. And it was these whispers, carried across generations, that later investigators would cling to when the official record proved empty, for sometimes the only surviving testimony is the one people are too afraid to write down. When modern researchers and urban explorers began to trespass into the overgrown ruins of the asylum, they found that the earth itself had preserved truths officials had tried to bury. Beneath layers of ivy and collapsed stone, they uncovered iron restraints fused into foundation walls, their metal warped but unmistakable. In shallow pits behind the grounds, they discovered fragments of human bone, too small to belong to adults, suggesting that children had been discarded like waste. One group unearthed a rusted lantern whose glass was etched with strange patterns, not decorative but precise, as though it had been used in experiments with light. Even more disturbing were the tunnels, narrow passageways that ran beneath the main ruins, partially collapsed yet still intact in stretches. These tunnels revealed rooms too low to stand in, lined with hooks, with soot-stained ceilings that suggested fires had been burned for reasons other than warmth. Graffiti from the asylum's final days still clung to the walls in charcoal, desperate scratches of names, prayers, and fragments of words like awake and watching. In one chamber, an explorer found a wooden box sealed in tar, inside of which were water-damaged journals containing crude sketches of human faces distorted into grotesque shapes, alongside notes describing threshold points and dream fractures. The handwriting matched that of doctors who had once worked in the facility, confirming these were not patient delusions, but staff records. Soil tests from the area revealed unusually high levels of mercury and lead, substances known to have been used in early psychiatric treatments, but in concentrations far too high for therapy, levels consistent with deliberate chemical exposure. The deeper explorers went, the more it became clear. This was not folklore, not exaggeration, but evidence of a systematic effort to manipulate and dismantle the human mind through physical, chemical, and psychological torture. And the fact that these remnants still lay buried beneath the ruins proved how carefully the officials' erasure had been staged. Destroy the building, suppress the records, but never fully cleanse the land. The asylum's soil became its own archive, holding proof for those willing to dig, proof that what was dismissed as ghost stories was, in fact, the last cries of a system that never intended to stop. The discoveries made by explorers and amateur historians should have triggered open investigations, but instead they ignited a wall of resistance that felt all too familiar. Universities dismissing the findings as misinterpretations of folklore, government agencies issuing statements that no verifiable evidence exists, and property owners swiftly filing trespassing charges to keep prying eyes away. When bones were turned over to local authorities for analysis, they were quietly labeled animal remains, despite independent forensic specialists later insisting the fragments bore human characteristics, particularly of children. Soil samples that tested high for mercury and lead mysteriously disappeared from university archives, with records later showing they had never been logged, as though the tests had not occurred at all. Even more telling was the way modern officials reacted, not with indifference, but with speed, as if they were already prepared to counter any narrative that might connect today's systems with the asylum's past. A historian who attempted to publish an article linking the ward's architectural design to early prison blueprints received sudden funding cuts and was pressured into withdrawing her manuscript. Explorers who posted their findings online reported being contacted by anonymous accounts warning them to stop before they lost more than just credibility. The message was clear. The asylum's secrets were not history. They were classified, still guarded, because they still mattered. Why would ruins more than a century old provoke such effort unless the practices perfected within them had never truly ended? Why silence evidence of restraint rooms, chemical contamination, and lost children unless acknowledging them would unravel the legitimacy of modern institutions? This pushback reveals the asylum was not just an aberration, but a cornerstone, its knowledge absorbed and protected, its methods reshaped into systems too powerful to expose. In the end, the very act of suppression became its own proof that the forgotten ward was never forgotten by those who inherited its designs. The silence around it today is not the silence of disinterest. It is the silence of fear. Fear that the world might recognize that the fire did not destroy the asylum's legacy. It spread it like embers into the foundations of the present. The most disturbing realization is not that the asylum once existed, but that its methods never died. They were simply rebranded, refined, and quietly institutionalized in systems we still walk through today. In modern psychiatric wards, patients are restrained under safety protocols that mirror the asylum's correction chambers, strapped to beds for hours, while fluorescent lights strip away all sense of time. In prisons, segregation cells recreate the very sensory deprivation once used to break minds in the ward, only now wrapped in sterile bureaucratic language like administrative separation. Schools, too, echo the geometry of control, the panopticon-like layouts, the enforced silence, the punishment of nonconformity dressed up as discipline. Even hospitals apply chemical sedation under the guise of treatment, much as the asylum once experimented with mixtures of opiates and stimulants to collapse a patient's perception of reality. What is sold as care, order, or reform often disguises the same formula the ward perfected: isolate, disorient, break, rebuild. The parallels are not coincidence, but lineage. Practices carried forward by doctors who trained in institutions seeded by asylum graduates, policies drafted by governments that quietly studied the old blueprints of control, and yet the language has been sanitized so thoroughly that most never question it. A child forced into a quiet room at school does not know they are experiencing a practice rooted in 19th century experimental torture. A prisoner locked in solitary for months cannot see that his suffering echoes techniques once tested on the incorrigible patients of the forgotten ward. The asylum's great achievement was not its cruelty, but its normalization, transforming brutality into procedure, abuse into policy, until society itself could no longer distinguish between punishment and progress. This is why officials still suppress the truth, because to admit what the ward truly was would force us to see how much of it we still live under. The asylum's walls may have collapsed, but its ghost is alive in fluorescent-lit rooms, in steel doors that slam shut, in the silence demanded of children and inmates alike. It was not a failure erased by fire. It was a prototype that succeeded so well we mistake its descendants for civilization itself. The asylum's greatest cruelty was not the chains or the chemicals, but the psychological strategies it pioneered, deliberate methods designed to dismantle identity and replace it with obedience. Survivors' fragmented testimonies reveal patterns too consistent to be coincidence. Patients were stripped not just of clothes, but of names, addressed only by numbers or clinical labels, severing the first anchor of selfhood. They were denied mirrors, calendars, or clocks, collapsing their sense of time and reflection until even memory became unreliable. Children were taught to betray one another, rewarded with food for reporting disobedience, a tactic that fractured bonds of trust and rewired loyalty toward authority. Patients who resisted were isolated for days in soundless chambers where whispers of orderlies were the only voices allowed to intrude, conditioning minds to equate silence with safety and obedience with survival. This was not punishment. It was programming. Once the individual's inner compass had been erased, staff introduced new identities: docile, compliant, pliant to suggestion. Journals recovered from the ruins describe experiments labeled induction of false recall, where patients were persuaded that events never lived were in fact their own memories, a chilling precursor to modern studies on implanted memory. Others detail obedience rehearsals, where the patient's resistance was worn down through cycles of deprivation and reward until their will collapsed completely. These strategies reveal that the ward was not a place of treatment, but of training, a laboratory for manufacturing compliance. And here lies the true horror. These very methods echo through modern systems: the stripping of names to numbers in prisons, the reward-punishment cycles in schools, the use of isolation to enforce conformity. All are psychological architectures first perfected in forgotten ward. The asylum proved that identity could be erased and rebuilt, that obedience could be manufactured not through persuasion, but through systematic dismantling of the self. It was not madness contained within walls, but method disguised as madness, refined into techniques of control that became templates for institutions worldwide. The fire may have blackened its stones, but the ward's psychological blueprints survived, smuggled into the very foundations of the world we inhabit. What makes the asylum even more sinister is the mounting evidence that the staff themselves were not simply cruel overseers, but participants, willing or otherwise, in an experiment that reached beyond the patients. Whispers in recovered letters, coupled with cryptic annotations in the surviving journals, suggest that the doctors and orderlies were subjected to the same cycles of surveillance and conditioning they inflicted on others. Pay records show turnover was abnormally high, with many employees leaving after only months, their departures marked not as resignations, but as terminations of functionality, a phrase disturbingly similar to how patients were described. Oral histories passed down by locals tell of staff seen wandering into town late at night, glassy-eyed, moving with mechanical precision, only to return the following day with no memory of their strange excursions. Some accounts even speak of employees collapsing mid-shift, convulsing violently, after which they were quietly removed from the grounds, never to be spoken of again. The blueprints of the asylum revealed hidden chambers not only for patients, but also for staff recuperation, a curious designation considering the notes attached. Monitor for dissociation, track compliance, administer reinforcement. This language implies that the staff themselves were monitored, tested, and reshaped, perhaps as much as those locked behind the bars. Could it be that the asylum was not simply an experiment on society's unwanted, but a training ground for obedience at every level? Patients broken into silence, staff molded into instruments of control, all overseen by a force that remained invisible. If so, then the institution was less a hospital and more a proving ground, a machine to test not only how far a human mind could be dismantled, but also how authority itself could be manufactured. This possibility cast every surviving name in the records under suspicion. Were these doctors pioneers of cruelty, or were they pawns, rewritten into roles they could not escape? And if those methods of shaping the shapers survived, passed into the institutions that inherited the ward's legacy, then perhaps even today those who enforce obedience are themselves controlled, part of a chain of manipulation that stretches far beyond the forgotten ruins. The asylum did not merely teach how to break the weak. It taught how to program the strong into becoming tools of the system itself. If the asylum's horrors had been born solely from local corruption, greed, or incompetence, the story would end as a tragedy confined to one institution. But evidence suggests otherwise. What unfolded there bore the fingerprints of a design too precise, too deliberate to be dismissed as an isolated atrocity. Buried within archival correspondence, researchers uncovered references to foreign benefactors, coded exchanges with shadowy medical societies in London and Paris, and hints of private funding routed through banking houses that never officially existed. The language of the asylum's founding documents, phrases like unrestricted study of deviance, controlled environments of consciousness, and transference of authority structures, aligns uncannily with notes from clandestine European fraternities of the 18th and 19th centuries, groups that operated behind the guise of medicine but pursued something far more dangerous: the engineering of the human will. It was as if the asylum was less a medical facility and more a laboratory outpost, a testing station where theories developed in secret lodges overseas could be applied to living flesh on the fringes of American society. Survivors describe seeing crates stamped with foreign insignias, packages of instruments unlike anything used by local physicians, and journals written in Latin and French detailing procedures that the staff themselves seemed to struggle to interpret. All of it points to one conclusion. The asylum was seeded by a network of hidden architects, men who understood that institutions designed to heal could more effectively be repurposed to control. They cloaked their work in charity, but beneath the veneer, they cultivated a system of obedience, refining methods to dismantle memory, shatter willpower, and reconstruct the self into something malleable. And what if this forgotten ward was never meant to be? The end in itself but merely the prototype, a field trial of techniques that would later ripple outward into prisons, schools, and even modern workplaces. If that is true, then what was once confined to those stone walls did not perish when the asylum fell silent. It spread, encoded into new institutions, refined and normalized until no one could recognize its origin. This is why the asylum's history is so dangerous, because it suggests the madness was not confined to its victims. It was systemic, intentional, and designed to endure long after the last door clanged shut and the final patient's scream was silenced. Decades after the asylum's doors were sealed and its walls left to rot beneath layers of ivy and silence, the same forbidden techniques began to resurface, this time under the flag of government authority, cloaked not in religious charity, but in the rhetoric of science and national security. In the mid-20th century, classified programs such as MK-Ultra, Bluebird, and Artichoke emerged, experimenting with hypnosis, sensory deprivation, chemical manipulation, and enforced trauma, all in the name of studying human behavior and control. Yet what makes these projects especially chilling is how closely their methods mirrored the notes and testimonies that had trickled out of the asylum a century earlier. Survivors had described long hours of isolation in lightless chambers, exposure to disorienting sounds designed to break thought patterns, and procedures that blurred the boundary between physical pain and psychological suggestion. These same elements reappeared in government files, almost word for word. Coincidence? Or the deliberate continuation of an old blueprint perfected behind the asylum's locked doors? Records suggest that some of the earliest consultants in these classified programs were European émigrés with backgrounds in obscure psychiatric practices, men whose predecessors could easily have been tied to the same hidden networks that once funded the asylum. One memo even referenced earlier American trials in institutional environments, a phrase so vague it almost seems to beg for erasure, as if the asylum's existence was an open secret among those who knew where power truly comes from. Imagine the implications, that what was once considered monstrous and unholy within the asylum's basement was later resurrected, refined, and justified under the banner of progress. This means the horrors of the ward were never an anomaly. They were the seed of a lineage, and in her, itance of control passed quietly from the cloisters of forgotten medicine into the iron grip of modern institutions. If you sense the weight of that, it is because you are beginning to see the pattern. Experiments hidden as healing, cruelty repackaged as progress, and the eternal search by those in power for ways to command not just bodies, but minds, identities, and the very essence of what it means to be human. What began within the asylum's walls as crude experimentation on the vulnerable, patients stripped of dignity, identities erased through enforced silence and ritual humiliation, did not end when its doors finally shut. Instead, it seeped like poison into the very fabric of society, disguised in structures so ordinary that most never question them. Schools, with their rows of desks, bells that regiment time, and punishments for disobedience, carried the faint but undeniable echo of the asylum's training in obedience and conformity. Factories, with endless shifts dictated by whistles and overseers, replicated the same systems of control where individuality was broken down for the sake of efficiency, just as the ward had once reduced patients to numbered files and routines. Even churches, once seen as sanctuaries, adopted tones of discipline and submission, demanding silence, ritual repetition, and the surrender of personal will to authority. This was not coincidence. It was the continuation of an old design, a design first tested in the asylum's laboratories of suffering. The wards were not simply a place of madness. They were a prototype, a model for how entire populations could be trained to accept power without questioning it, to obey orders as though resistance were unthinkable. Children learned early to stand in line, to raise their hands for permission, to internalize shame when they failed to conform, rituals eerily similar to the punishments and reinforcements once inflicted on the insane. Workers learned to labor until exhaustion under systems that never considered their humanity, echoing the treatment of those who once toiled endlessly in the asylum's workshops. The asylum may have been hidden, walled off, and later abandoned, but its architecture of control escaped into the world, reshaping modern life into a silent institution without walls. In this way, the forgotten ward was never truly forgotten. It was replicated, expanded, and normalized until no one could see where the asylum ended and everyday life began. And if you think this pattern is exaggeration, ask yourself why the structures you live in, your workplace, your school, your church, still rely on methods first perfected on the powerless, on the silenced, on those who could not resist. That is the asylum's true legacy, not the madness it contained, but the order it unleashed. The asylum's cruelty was not confined to its doctors or its experiments. The very bricks, corridors, and windows were designed as instruments of control, turning architecture itself into a weapon against the mind. Survivors' accounts and the rare architectural sketches that remain reveal a building constructed with eerie precision, where nothing was accidental. Corridors stretched endlessly in straight lines, devoid of markers, so that patients wandering them became disoriented, stripped of their sense of space and time. The ceilings were unnaturally high, amplifying every sound, footsteps, whispers, cries, until noise itself became a tool of terror, overwhelming the senses and creating an environment of constant anxiety. Windows were placed deliberately high on the walls, allowing light to filter in without offering any view of the outside world, severing the natural rhythm of day and night and replacing it with the institution's imposed schedule of bells and orders. Even the color of the walls, a pale and sickly shade meant to appear calming, instead reflected the light in a way that washed faces pale, making the sick look ghostly and the healthy look ill, eroding identity until all appeared equally lifeless. This was not random. It was intentional conditioning. The asylum was an early prototype of what later became known as panoptic design, the architecture of surveillance and psychological discipline. The same strategies migrated into prisons, where endless corridors and high vantage points made escape unthinkable, into military barracks, where uniform rows and the absence of individuality trained soldiers to move as one, and even into modern corporate offices, where open spaces and glass partitions strip away privacy while enforcing silent observation. The asylum was never just a building. It was a system, a model of how environment itself could break a human being more effectively than chains. And once perfected on the forgotten, it was replicated for the masses, turning entire societies into institutions where behavior is shaped not by visible whips, but by invisible walls. When you walk through the narrow halls of a school or sit beneath the fluorescent glare of an office, you are living within echoes of that same design, still active, still shaping, still reminding us that the asylum never died. It was simply rebuilt in new forms, with you as its patient. Among the most disturbing details buried in the asylum's records are the descriptions of its experiments with sound, experiments so strange and precise that they seemed less like treatment and more like deliberate assaults on the psyche. Witness accounts describe endless nights where patients were subjected to monotonous chants, repeated prayers in hollow tones, or mechanical rhythms produced by crude devices that throbbed like a heartbeat through the walls. Some rooms were said to vibrate with low-frequency hums that rattled the bones and set teeth on edge, while others pulsed with relentless tapping sounds that mimicked dripping water, a rhythm that drove many into fits of panic and screaming. The doctors believed sound could bypass the rational mind, worming its way directly into the subconscious, reshaping thought through repetition and unease. They noted that after hours of exposure, patients no longer resisted commands, their willpower crumbling beneath the weight of engineered noise. One particularly unsettling document mentions the hymn experiment, where a choir of attendants sang the same verse for 12 continuous hours while patients were restrained, forcing them to endure until voices broke and sanity itself seemed to dissolve into the drone. Decades later, these same principles re-emerged not only in propaganda, but in modern advertising, where jingles and slogans were designed to repeat until they became inescapable. Military psychological warfare units deployed similar tactics, blasting enemy combatants with dissonant music, screams, or high-pitched frequencies to break resistance. Even today, soundscapes are used in public spaces, music in stores to control mood, repetitive announcements in train stations, the sterile hum of fluorescent lights in offices, all echoes of a science first perfected in the asylum's halls. Sound, the most invisible of forces, was discovered to be one of the most powerful tools of control, and the asylum's doctors wielded it like a scalpel against the soul. Think of that, the next time a tune lingers in your head against your will, or when background noise unsettles you without reason, because the methods that haunt you were born in that ward, refined in secrecy, and unleashed upon the world as instruments of silent domination. Perhaps the cruelest practice in the forgotten ward was not the restraints or the shocks, but the systematic erasure of identity, the deliberate stripping away of names, memories, and family ties until nothing remained but obedience to the institution. New arrivals were rarely addressed by their given names. Instead, they were assigned numbers, often sewn onto their gowns, reducing a human being to an entry in a ledger. Letters from families were intercepted or destroyed, visits denied, and any mention of life outside the asylum was forbidden. Over time, many inmates could no longer recall their own birthdays, hometowns, or even the faces of loved ones. One chilling record describes a mother who begged daily for her children, only to be told for years that she had none, until at last she stopped asking. Her mind rewired to accept the void the asylum had imposed. This practice of identity erasure was not merely cruelty. It was the foundation of control. For a person without memory or history can be reshaped into anything authority desires, and here lies the disturbing legacy. This same tactic re-emerged across modern institutions. Governments built vast bureaucracies of registration, passports, identification numbers, and state-issued records, creating systems where the state, not the family, not the individual, defined who you were. In wars and camps, prisoners were tattooed with numbers on their arms, echoing the asylum's cruel habit of numerical reduction. In orphanages and workhouses, children were renamed to sever ties with their origins, breaking any resistance rooted in family or heritage. Even today, our lives are cataloged in databases and IDs, our worth tied to documents that can be revoked or erased. The asylum's destruction of personal identity was not an isolated atrocity. It was a prototype, a revelation that the surest way to dominate a population is not through chains on the body, but through the erasure and reconstruction of the self. What began in those dim wards as a cruel experiment on the powerless became the blueprint for the modern state's obsession with surveillance and record-keeping, an invisible cage in which individuality can be dissolved at the stroke of a pen. The asylum taught them that control begins by making a person forget who they are until they become only what the institution allows them to be. Inside the forgotten ward, time itself was not a natural flow, but a weapon wielded with precision, an invisible leash designed to break resistance and shape obedience. Bells tolled at dawn, at meals, at prayers, at labor, at lights out, until patients no longer trusted their own sense of hours or days, living instead by the relentless rhythm imposed upon them. Sleep was fragmented by sudden nighttime inspections, meals were rationed at irregular intervals to disorient hunger, and punishments often included the removal of all markers of time, no windows, no clocks, no contact with the world beyond. Survivors later recalled the terror of not knowing whether they had been inside for weeks or years, as if their lives had been suspended in a timeless fog controlled entirely by the institution. And it is here that we see the asylum's true legacy, the weaponization of time itself as a tool of control. When industry rose in the 19th century, factories adopted the same regimented discipline. Whistles commanding when to rise, when to labor, when to rest, until human lives bent around the clock rather than the sun. Schools soon followed, drilling children to obey bells, to break tasks into rigid periods, to internalize shame if they failed to keep pace. Military barracks perfected the system, ensuring that soldiers marched, ate, and slept in lockstep, erasing individuality through the tyranny of synchronized hours. Even churches, once governed by seasonal cycles, shifted into rigid schedules, binding worship to timetables rather than organic gathering. Today, though the asylum has crumbled into ruin, its ghost lingers in every alarm that drags you from sleep, every calendar that dictates your worth, every clock that ticks louder in your mind the more you try to resist. The discipline of time, perfected first on the forgotten and powerless, has become the foundation of modern existence, binding entire populations in invisible chains that do not rattle but tick, commanding obedience without ever having to raise a whip. The ward revealed a terrible truth. To control time is to control people, and once humanity was trained to obey the clock, the asylum's walls no longer needed to stand, because the world itself became the ward. Beyond its architecture, its sounds, and its clocks, the asylum also thrived on ritual, strange, repetitive ceremonies that blurred the line between medicine and religion, science and superstition. Survivors spoke of being forced to kneel at dawn in rows, reciting chants not of prayer, but of obedience, words drilled into them until their own voices became instruments of submission. Others were compelled to perform confessions, speaking their supposed sins or delusions aloud while attendants took notes, not to heal them, but to break them, to make them believe their suffering was deserved. Meals, too, became ritualized acts, with patients required to sit in absolute silence, eat in unison, and finish at the strike of a bell, turning the simple act of nourishment into an exercise in discipline. Punishments often took on a ceremonial quality. Public humiliations carried out before the ward, a shaming that resembled excommunication more than medical correction. Over time, these rituals hollowed the self, replacing inner belief with mechanical compliance. What the asylum perfected in secret would later be echoed in broader society. Schools opened each day with pledges or prayers that drilled loyalty into children before they could even think critically. Militaries crafted elaborate initiation rites and drills to bond soldiers into unquestioning units. Corporations invented morning meetings and team chants that, under the guise of unity, served only to ingrain obedience. Even religious institutions adapted, often relying less on true spiritual experience and more on rote repetition of creeds, confessions, and formal gestures that kept the body occupied while the mind submitted. Ritual, once thought sacred, was re-engineered by the ward into a tool of psychological conditioning, a way to bypass thought entirely, embedding obedience in muscle memory and reflex. And this is the unspoken inheritance of the asylum, that the rituals which govern our schools, our jobs, our armies, and even our faith are not so different from those dim ceremonies carried out in the forgotten ward. They remind us that control works best not when it is enforced through violence, but when it is repeated until it feels natural, until obedience is mistaken for tradition, and tradition mistaken for truth. Hunger was one of the asylum's most insidious weapons, for it required no whips, no chains, no overt violence, only the slow, deliberate withholding of food until the body itself betrayed the mind. Patients were often fed thin broths devoid of nutrition, portions so small that starvation became a permanent condition, yet the doctors framed it as therapeutic fasting, claiming it purged illness, calmed the nerves, and subdued violent impulses. In truth, it was a calculated tool of domination. The constant gnaw of hunger eroded resistance, made the body pliant, the will weak, the thoughts fogged. Records describe patients so desperate that they fought like animals over scraps of bread, a cruelty deliberately staged by attendants to pit the desperate against each other. Others were force-fed bitter concoctions through funnels, not to nourish, but to humiliate, reinforcing that even survival was no longer theirs to control. Over time, many inmates forgot the simple pleasure of eating. They learned to treat food not as a natural right, but as a conditional mercy granted by their captors. This strategy, born in the asylum's dining halls, would later resurface in broader society. In prisons where rations became tools of discipline, in war camps where starvation was policy, in factories where meals were dictated by the whistle, binding nourishment to productivity. Even in modern consumer culture, echoes remain in the endless diets and food industries that manipulate hunger, in rationing that made entire populations dependent on state supply during wartime, and in economic systems where scarcity keeps workers compliant. The asylum revealed a grim truth. Control the stomach, and you control the soul. Hunger makes obedience feel like survival, and survival itself becomes an act of submission. And so, the ward's cruel experiments with food were never buried with its walls. They were refined, codified, and unleashed on societies that never realized they were inheriting the tactics of a madhouse. In every cafeteria line, every ration book, every imposed fast disguised as virtue, you can still feel the ward's shadow, teaching us that the simplest, most human act of eating can be transformed into an invisible chain. Sleep, the final refuge of the broken, was never safe within the ward. The asylum's overseers quickly discovered that the mind, stripped of rest, became as malleable as wet clay, and so they turned the night itself into a weapon. Patients were woken at random hours by the clang of bells, the sudden blare of whistles, or the jarring scrape of iron keys along the bars of their cells. Some were forbidden to sleep for days, forced to pace dim corridors until their legs buckled, while others were granted only minutes of rest before being shaken awake to repeat the cycle. Attendants reported inducing nightmares by playing strange sounds during the brief hours when inmates drifted off. Moans, distorted hymns, or whispered commands, so that even in sleep, the mind was not free from intrusion. Records describe patients who begged for unconsciousness as though it were food, others who wept uncontrollably when told they must remain awake, their sanity unraveling with every lost hour. This torment was recorded clinically as hypnotic weakening, a term masking what was truly happening: the systematic breaking of resistance by depriving the soul of its most basic restoration. And this method, perfected in the asylum's silent halls, would not die with its collapse. Military interrogators later revived it, keeping prisoners awake for days until they confessed to anything demanded. Prison guards employed it to keep inmates submissive, hollowing their spirits without ever lifting a hand in violence. Even the modern world hums with its legacy. Endless night shifts, corporate cultures that glorify sleeplessness as productivity, glowing screens engineered to delay rest, a society designed to keep its people exhausted and pliant. The asylum proved long ago that an unrested mind is an obedient mind, and the world learned well. Today, when you find yourself too tired to resist, too weary to question, too drained to dream, you are living in the echo of the ward's nightmarish design, a system that understood that to rob a person of sleep is to rob them of their very self. If hunger broke the body and sleeplessness broke the mind, then the ward's manipulation of human connection shattered the soul. Isolation was among its cruelest tactics. Patients were locked away in solitary chambers for weeks, denied speech, touch, or even the sound of another human voice, until their sense of self dissolved into the silence. Others, however, endured the opposite cruelty. They were forced into false bonds, paired with strangers, and compelled to act as families under the watchful eye of attendants. Mothers were assigned children not their own and ordered to care for them. Siblings were fabricated out of unrelated inmates and punished if they refused to play along. Over time, real family ties faded, blurred by the institution's enforced simulations. This was not treatment, it was reprogramming. The doctors discovered that by severing genuine connection and replacing it with counterfeit roles, they could make individuals attached to the institution itself as their only source of belonging. And this, more than any shock or chain, ensured obedience, for to rebel meant not just punishment, but exile into total loneliness. The asylum had uncovered one of the deepest truths of control, that humans will accept almost any cruelty if it comes with the illusion of community. And just as with its other methods, this revelation did not die with the ward. It seeped outward into orphanages that deliberately renamed children and split siblings apart, into militaries that forced strangers into artificial brotherhoods under command, into factories and corporations that coined the term family while demanding loyalty unto exhaustion. Even modern states wield the same weapon, reshaping communities with propaganda, dividing and reassigning identities until natural bonds give way to engineered allegiance. The ward's manipulation of connection teaches us that the surest way to, O master of people, is not simply to isolate them, nor simply to bind them together, but to decide for them who they are allowed to belong to, and then make that belonging conditional. In every false fraternity, in every broken family line, in every institution that demands loyalty in exchange for acceptance, the shadow of the forgotten ward remains, whispering its terrible lesson. Love and connection can be manufactured, weaponized, and turned into chains stronger than iron. Pain in the forgotten ward was never merely punishment. It was ritualized, calculated, and applied not to correct behavior, but to engrave obedience into the deepest layers of the psyche. Patients were subjected to carefully measured torments, cold baths that froze the body until lips turned blue, binding chairs that forced the spine into unnatural angles for hours, clamps that pressed against temples to create waves of migraine-like agony. Yet attendants recorded these acts clinically, not as cruelty, but as therapeutic interventions, ensuring that suffering could masquerade as treatment. What made the pain more terrifying was its ritual quality, always delivered at the same time of day, often in front of others, sometimes accompanied by chants or recitations, as though the body's torment were part of a larger ceremony of dominance. Survivors recalled how the dread of scheduled pain was often worse than the act itself. The waiting hollowed them, made them compliant long before the first lash or clamp. The ward's doctors seemed to understand what modern behavioral science would later prove, that pain is most effective not when it destroys, but when it is paired with repetition, timing, and meaning, until the victim begins to anticipate and internalize the suffering as natural. This lesson echoed forward through history, in prisons where punishments became ritual displays of authority, in militaries where physical hardship was sanctified as discipline, in schools where corporal punishment was framed as moral correction. Even in religions where penance, fasting, and self-denial turned suffering into proof of purity. Pain became not simply something to fear, but something institutions used to shape identity, loyalty, and submission. The asylum was the crucible in which this transformation took place, where pain ceased to be a failure of humanity and became instead a tool of order wielded with the precision of ritual. And this is its darkest legacy, that systems across the world learned from its hidden lessons, embedding pain into daily life so subtly that many mistake it for tradition, justice, or even love. The ward taught that pain need not kill to control, it only needs to repeat, until obedience feels easier than resistance. In the forgotten ward, pain was only the first instrument. The second, far more insidious, was the systematic rewriting of truth itself. Patients were interrogated not to uncover reality but to obliterate it, forced to confess to crimes they never committed, to betray family members who had never betrayed them, to renounce beliefs that had once anchored their very identity. If the screams of pain hollowed out the body, then these interrogations hollowed out the mind. Witnesses described how questions were asked in endless loops, how contradictions were deliberately introduced until memory itself began to fracture, and how the ward's physicians recorded these manufactured confessions as evidence of progress. Over time, victims learned that resisting was futile. The only survival was to adopt the false narratives being fed into them until the lie became safer than the truth. What happened in that asylum was not isolated. It was the prototype of every system that has ever thrived on deception. You see it in political regimes that force loyalty oaths, in corporations that rewrite scandals as successes, in media that repeat distortions until repetition makes them feel like fact. Even in families, the pattern endures, where silence about abuse becomes the enforced narrative of everything is fine. The ward exposed a terrifying truth. Human beings can be trained to abandon their own memories and accept implanted ones if the cost of resistance is high enough. Once a man begins to doubt his own recollections, once he begins to fear that his mind is no longer his own, he becomes malleable, pliable, open to any suggestion. The doctors of the ward knew this, which is why they broke truth, not with grand revelations, but with relentless, subtle corrosion. And the world has followed their example, teaching men not to trust their eyes, not to trust their instincts, not even to trust their own memories. This is why so many live like sleepwalkers today, unable to distinguish between truth and lies, because their entire lives are built on the same template that was perfected in those asylum halls. The final cruelty of the ward was not the pain it inflicted, but the truths it erased and replaced, leaving survivors unsure whether their nightmares were real or manufactured. Exactly the condition in which power thrives. If the ward's torture of body and mind broke resistance, then its chambers of isolation completed the transformation, for it was in the silence of solitary confinement that men and women dissolved into shadows of themselves. These were not simple, locked rooms. They were constructed with precision, designed to strip away every anchor of human orientation. The cells were narrow and windowless, with walls so thick no sound could penetrate, creating a void where even the rhythm of footsteps could not be tracked. Survivors described the terrifying absence of time, days bleeding into nights without markers, minutes stretching into eternities until thought itself lost coherence. Some clawed at the stone walls until their nails tore away, desperate to feel anything beyond the crushing weight of stillness. But this was the point: to separate man not only from others, but from himself, until the boundary between mind and environment collapsed. And from this collapse, obedience was born. For the ward's doctors understood something chilling, that isolation is not passive, it is active erasure, a force that dissolves the will more efficiently than violence. The patterns seeded there spread outward, becoming the blueprint for prison solitary cells, interrogation black sites, and even the subtler forms of isolation in modern life: cubicles that separate workers, screens that divide families, ideologies that alienate neighbors. All are structures of controlled loneliness, engineered to weaken the bonds that make resistance possible. The ward proved that when a man is truly alone, long enough and deep enough, he will eventually turn inward and find nothing solid to cling to. At that moment, he can be remade. This was the forbidden lesson, one so dangerous it was hidden under the language of discipline and rehabilitation. Yet it endures, shaping the invisible prisons in which millions now live, surrounded by people but untouched by genuine connection. What began in the forgotten ward's silence was not simply confinement, but the birth of psychological warfare itself, a recognition that you do not need chains to bind men. You only need walls thick enough that their cries are swallowed before anyone can hear them. If the ward's walls of silence could dissolve the mind in waking hours, then its most insidious weapon was unleashed in the hours meant for rest, for sleep itself became the battlefield upon which sanity was surrendered. The attendants mastered a brutal rhythm of deprivation and distortion, waking patients just as they drifted into deep slumber, dragging them into blinding light, forcing them to march chant, or sit motionless until exhaustion collapsed them back into shallow half-dreams, only to be jarred awake again. Within days, the body ceased to know night from day, and within weeks, the mind's defenses crumbled, giving way to hallucinations, paranoia, and the terrifying inability to separate dream from reality. The ward's doctors knew this was the fulcrum of control. When a man could not trust his own perceptions, he could be made to believe anything, even to confess crimes he never committed, or claim to see visions that were fed to him in whispered suggestion. More sinister still, certain therapies involved deliberately planting imagery into the minds of the sleep-starved, reciting phrases or grotesque imagery in the liminal space between waking and dream, ensuring that patients awoke, convinced of memories they had never lived. This was not madness born of neglect, but madness engineered with precision, for the ward had stumbled upon what later cults, secret orders, and intelligence agencies would all exploit. The human mind is most vulnerable when it is suspended between exhaustion and dream. From the brainwashing camps of war to the whispered mantras of religious sects to modern experiments with sensory manipulation, the fingerprints of the forgotten ward linger like a shadow. It was here that dreams were no longer private refuges but invaded territories, bent and broken until the victim himself begged for the authority of his captors to define what was real. In the forgotten ward, even sleep was stolen, turned into a weapon that gnawed at the soul until men awoke begging for a reality dictated by others. This was not medicine. It was sorcery dressed in science, and its echo has never truly left us. Of all the horrors whispered about the forgotten ward, none are as grotesquely theatrical, as deliberately cruel, as the so-called mock funerals staged for patients who had not yet died but were declared lost by the doctors. Imagine it. A man or woman still breathing, still conscious, drugged just enough to be immobile yet aware, laid upon a stretcher and carried down the dim halls while attendants hummed dirges in cracked monotones, their bodies draped in makeshift shrouds. They were placed into crude coffins, built not for burial but for spectacle, wheeled into the chapel where other patients, broken and terrified, were forced to watch. A priest, or sometimes merely a doctor wearing the robes of one, would recite the rites of death over them, declaring their soul released while their chest still rose and fell in shallow rhythm. To the witnesses, it was a living nightmare, the blurring of the boundary between life and death weaponized as a lesson. Resist, and this will be your fate. Question us, and you will be erased while you still draw breath. When the ritual concluded, the patient was not buried but entombed in isolation, sealed away in padded cells without mirrors, without sound, without acknowledgement, as though the world had agreed they no longer existed. Days later, when they were dragged back into the ward, stripped of name and identity, the other inmates would avert their eyes, for to recognize the dead was to risk sharing their fate. The genius of this cruelty was not in the physical torment, but in the symbolic murder of the self, forcing a man to witness his own funeral, to see his own life declared finished while he was still conscious, created a fracture so deep that many never spoke again. And here lies the chilling truth. The practice did not die within those walls. Variations of the ritual echo in modern systems of control, from secret prisons where detainees are disappeared without records to psychological operations that erase identities and rewrite them anew. The forgotten ward perfected not just the breaking of bodies, but the burial of living souls, the killing of names before the flesh itself succumbed. In that dark theater of false funerals, death was no longer the end. It was a tool wielded against the living to bend them into silence. If the mock funerals annihilated the individual, then the ward's final cruelty was aimed at entire lineages, entire histories, erasing not just men and women, but their names, their families, their legacies, as if they had never been born. When a patient was declared non-recoverable, their files were rewritten, their photographs destroyed, and their identities expunged from parish records, census logs, even burial registers. Letters from loved ones were intercepted and burned, replies forged to convince families that their kin had either died suddenly or vanished without explanation. In some cases, marriages were annulled by falsified certificates, children told that their parents had abandoned them or never existed at all. This was not negligence, it was policy, a deliberate cleansing of memory, as though the ward sought not just to manage the insane, but to unmake them. The erased became phantoms in their own bloodlines, their stories dissolving into whispered rumors of great-uncles who went away, or a sister no one spoke of. Generations later, descendants would stumble upon fragments, a half-burned birth record, a grave with no body beneath it, a photograph with faces scratched out, and realize something monstrous had been done, but never learn the full truth. In this way, the ward's reach extended beyond the walls, across decades, across families, until silence itself became its weapon, making people afraid to ask questions for fear of what it might expose. And here lies the chilling continuity. Such erasures are not relics of the past. States, regimes, and institutions still deploy the same method, cleansing archives, rewriting official histories, vanishing those who become inconvenient. The forgotten ward was not an isolated madhouse, it was a laboratory of oblivion, a proving ground for the machinery of erasure that the modern world continues to refine. When you walk among cemeteries and see rows of stones marked unknown, or open family trees with entire branches cut away, you are staring at the fingerprints of this legacy. The ward did not just bury its patients. It buried their histories, their futures, and the very memory that they had once lived. In the end, the greatest madness was not locked inside the asylum, but released from it. A contagion of silence that taught institutions how to kill not only people, but the very idea that they ever existed. The silence of the ward might have remained sealed forever had it not been for a chance discovery, one born not of justice, but of neglect, when decades after its closure, the crumbling structure was slated for demolition, and workmen prying at the rotting timbers stumbled upon a hidden archive sealed behind false walls. There, in iron cabinets mottled with rust, lay files no historian was meant to touch. Patient registers with names crossed out in red ink, death certificates issued for men and women whose bodies were never found. And most chilling of all, photographs, hundreds of them, showing gaunt faces with hollow eyes, some staged to appear dead, others with mouths sewn shut, as though the camera itself had been recruited into the ritual of silence. Among the papers were transcripts of experiments, therapies, detailed with clinical precision, and notes exchanged between doctors that read less like medical correspondence and more like occult instructions, referring to the burial of the living, the removal of self, and the crafting of silence as obedience. Scrawled margins betrayed moments of doubt, brief flashes of humanity, where even staff confessed nightmares of being buried alive, of hearing the footsteps of those they had declared gone, still pacing the halls at night. Yet these doubts never stopped the machine. The ward devoured until the state itself decided it was no longer useful and quietly shuttered its gates. When the archive was uncovered, officials arrived within hours, seizing boxes before the press could glimpse them, issuing bland statements about standard hospital records, but fragments had already slipped through, scavenged by demolition crews, smuggled into private hands, whispered into underground circles of researchers. It was through these fragments that the true horror emerged, pieced together like the bones of an unearthed grave. And all much was reburied by authorities. Enough escaped to prove beyond doubt that the forgotten ward was not a sanctuary of healing, but a factory of erasure, a crucible of psychological weaponry. What was meant to be a quiet demolition became the accidental exhumation of an atrocity, the first crack in the silence the ward had built so carefully. And it is through that crack, through these scraps of paper and faded photographs, that we glimpse what institutions hoped would never surface. Proof that the line between medicine and manipulation, between healing and obliteration, was crossed deliberately, and the knowledge harvested from human ruin was never truly buried. The story of the forgotten ward does not end in rubble or dust, nor in the yellowed pages of a confiscated archive. It ends in us, in the systems we live under, for the ward's legacy was never buried, only refined and renamed, reborn in modern institutions that wear the mask of progress while wielding the same instruments of silence. Today we call it psychological conditioning, behavioral modification, or enhanced interrogation, but the bones of the practice remain the same. Strip a person of identity, fracture their sleep, feed them symbols until they cannot tell dream from waking, erase their past until they accept the reality handed to them. Prisons vanish inmates into black sites without trial. Hospitals medicate the inconvenient until their families are told they no longer recognize them. And bureaucracies bury records so that whole lineages dissolve into nothing more than questions whispered at kitchen tables. Even our technology has become a ward without walls, feeding illusions, altering memory, bending perception until truth itself is pliable clay. The rituals of mock funerals echo in the ways lives are digitally erased, accounts deleted, reputations buried while the body still lives. The practice of engineered sleep deprivation thrives in interrogation rooms and corporate laboratories alike, testing the limits of the mind when fractured by exhaustion. And the systematic rewriting of history, perfected in the ward's hidden halls, now plays out on a global scale, where entire events are scrubbed, denied, or rewritten, until doubt itself becomes the only certainty. The forgotten ward was not an aberration. It was a blueprint, a quiet prototype of the world we now inhabit, where silence is crafted, identities erased, and madness engineered, not for healing, but for control. To look away from its legacy is to walk willingly into its grasp, for what was once Confu. Into a single asylum now stretches its shadow across nations. The ward may have been demolished, its stones carted away, its name reduced to a footnote, but its voice still whispers in boardrooms, laboratories, and cells, reminding us that the most dangerous institutions are not the ones that kill bodies, but the ones that bury souls while they still breathe. And so, the final question remains, not whether the forgotten ward is gone, but whether we ever truly escaped it, or whether we too are now inmates in a grander asylum, one without visible walls, waiting for our own mock funeral to be read.